A family friend is charged with kidnapping and killing a 5-year-old girl from central Minnesota.
Well, Frank Anderson faces serious charges for a crime that many are having a hard time coming to terms with. He's charged with taking 5-year-old Elena Ertl from her home in a truck he took from her father and driving her 80 miles away. That's where investigators found her lifeless body and the man they believe is responsible for her death.
Hi, welcome to Crime Daily Series Documentary. If you are new to this channel, subscribe to hit 1 million subscribers. 2 a.m. Central Time, August 20th, 2016. Watkins, Minnesota. A 5-year-old girl has fallen asleep on the living room floor. Her mother, Kayla, lifts her gently, carries her down the hallway, and lays her in her own bed. She pulls up the blanket the little girl sleeps with every single night, an Elsa blanket, soft and worn from use. She kisses her goodnight. The house is quiet. Nothing about this night feels any different from 100 nights before it. By 8:30 the next morning, that bed will be empty. There will be no broken window, no forced door, no sound anyone in that house remembers hearing. Just an empty bed, a missing truck, and a family friend who had gone to sleep down the hall. Gone too. Within 24 hours, the state of Minnesota will issue an Amber Alert. Within 48, this quiet town of under 1,000 people will bury a child. And within a year, investigators will uncover a warning sign a full decade old, one that, had it been visible to the people who trusted this man with their home, might have changed everything. This is the case of Elena Ertl. Before we get into it, if you're new here, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if true crime cases like this one matter to you, hit that subscribe button, because we cover a new case every week. What happened to Elena Ertl isn't a story about a stranger in the shadows. It's a story about how completely a family can trust someone, how ordinary that trust can look from the outside, and how a single night can undo it all. It's also, as you'll see, a story about a warning sign that existed years before this ever happened, one that never reached the people who needed to see it. We're going to walk through this case in the order it actually unfolded. The night itself, the frantic search that followed, the break that came from the last person anyone expected, and then, once the immediate case was resolved, the much older story investigators uncovered underneath it. Because this isn't just a case about what happened to one family in one small town over one terrible night. It's also a case about how far back a pattern can go before anyone connects the dots, and what it means for a community when those dots finally do connect, 10 years too late. Let's get into it. Watkins, Minnesota has a population of just under 1,000 people, sitting quietly in the heart of the central part of the state. It's the kind of small town where people leave their doors unlocked, where neighbors wave from front porches, and where everybody doesn't just know your name, they know your whole family, going back 2 generations. There are no big city headlines here, no major crimes making the evening news. Just a tight-knit community, built on familiarity and the particular kind of comfort that comes from knowing every face on every street. Just 1 month before this case unfolded, in July of 2016, Watkins had already been hit hard. A tornado tore through the town without warning, tearing apart homes, uprooting trees, and leaving behind a community that was still, quite literally, in the middle of picking up the pieces. People were exhausted, they were hurting, but the way small towns across the Midwest tend to, they were rebuilding. Right in the middle of all that rebuilding was a family named Ertl. Matt and Kayla Ertl were raising their children in Watkins, living the kind of life this town was built around, and at the center of their world was a 5-year-old girl named Elena. Elena Jean Ertl was not just a name in a case file. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, a force. She loved pink, she loved purple, she loved dressing up, but in the same breath, she'd follow her dad out to the barn, climb up without hesitating, and get her hands dirty without a second thought. She'd recently finished preschool at Eden Valley Watkins Elementary. Her family's own words, written after her death, described her simply: an animal lover, a princess, a singer, a great friend to everyone she met. She loved learning from her older brother, and she always gave the best hugs. If she missed even a single day of school, people noticed right away. Her absence felt loud, the way only a truly present kid's absence can. On October 31st, just over 2 months after that August night, Elena was supposed to turn 6 years old. Halloween was going to be her birthday. Costumes, candy, cake, all of it. A milestone her family had been looking forward to all summer. Nobody had any idea that celebration would never happen the way they'd planned it. The Ertles were, by every outward measure, an ordinary family living an ordinary life in a town built for exactly that kind of ordinary happiness. Matt worked for a utility line company. Kayla managed the daily rhythm of raising young children in a place where that rhythm looked much the same as it had for generations. School in the fall, softball in the summer, church on Sundays, neighbors who'd known each other's families for decades. Elena had an older brother she adored, and by all accounts, the two of them had the kind of sibling relationship where she followed him around trying to learn whatever he was doing, whether that meant a video game, a bike trick, or just the particular way he found something funny. That closeness, to her brother, to her parents, to the wider community around her, is part of what made this town's grief so total when the news broke. This wasn't a case people read about happening somewhere else. This was a family whose faces they recognized at the grocery store, whose kids played alongside their own kids, whose ordinary Tuesday afternoons looked exactly like everyone else's ordinary Tuesday afternoons, right up until the moment they didn't. And it's worth remembering, too, just how raw Watkins already was, heading into that August. A town of under 1,000 people had spent the previous month clearing storm debris, patching roofs, comforting neighbors who'd lost far more than shingles and gutters. There's a particular kind of resilience that gets asked of small communities after a natural disaster, the kind that shows up in casserole dishes left on porches and volunteer crews working through the weekend. Watkins had already leaned on that resilience once that summer. Nobody could have known they'd be asked to find an entirely different, far darker version of it again within weeks. August 19th, 2016, a Friday night in Watkins. Matt Ertle and a friend and co-worker named Zachary Anderson had just finished up a local softball game. Nothing unusual there. They played on the same team regularly, and Anderson, who worked with Matt at a utility line company, had known the family for roughly 4 years. He lived in Coon Rapids, a fair distance away, so when the two of them played softball together in the summer, it wasn't unusual for him to spend the night at the Ertle home afterward, rather than make the drive back. It had happened before. He was comfortable there. He was welcome there. The family had no reason to think twice about it. After the game, the two men headed out to unwind. First to a local bar where the rest of the team had gathered. Then, after that closed around 1 a.m., to a second spot just a couple of blocks from the Ertle home. Meanwhile, back at the house, Kayla was up with the kids. At 2 a.m. on August 20th, Elena had fallen asleep in the living room. Kayla carried her down the hallway, laid her in her bed, and pulled her Elsa blanket up over her shoulders. The same blanket she slept with every night, and the same blanket that would later become one of the most heartbreaking details in this entire case. Matt got home around 2:30 a.m. Anderson arrived shortly after, somewhere between 3:30 and 3:45. According to court records, the two men talked until around 4 a.m., at which point Matt went to bed. Anderson staying over was, again, entirely unremarkable. This had happened before, and there was nothing about that night that gave anyone in that house a reason for concern. At some point between 4 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., something happened inside that house, and no one in it heard a single thing. It's worth sitting with how ordinary every piece of that evening looked in isolation. A softball game with coworkers, a stop at a bar afterward, the way plenty of small-town Friday nights end, a friend crashing at the house rather than driving home late, which by every account had happened before without incident. None of these details, taken individually, would raise a single flag for any family living an ordinary life in an ordinary town. That's precisely what makes this case so difficult to sit with. There was no moment, no decision point, where a reasonable person watching from the outside would have said something is wrong here. The wrongness wasn't visible. It was entirely internal to one person in that house, and it stayed invisible until it was already far too late. 8:30 a.m., August 20th, 2016. Matt and Kayla wake up, and almost immediately, something feels wrong. They go to check on Elena. Her bed is empty. They check the bedroom, the bathroom, every room in the house. She isn't there. And it isn't just Elena who's missing. Matt's 2002 GMC Sierra pickup is gone from the driveway. His personal cell phone, which had been left inside the truck, is gone with it. And Zachary Anderson, who had gone to sleep in their home just hours earlier, is nowhere to be found. Matt and Kayla searched the yard, the property, every inch of the surrounding area. When it became clear this was far beyond anything they could handle alone, they called it in. At around 10 a.m., the Meeker County Sheriff's Office received the missing persons report. Officers arrived, and within minutes, it was clear this wasn't a child who had wandered off. There was no accident here. Every marking pointed to a deliberate abduction. Investigators moved immediately. Deputies canvassed the neighborhood and nearby businesses, pulling whatever security footage they could find, hoping for a lead. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension joined the investigation and widened the search area. And crucially, investigators began tracking the signal from Matt's cell phone, still inside the stolen truck, pinging off cell towers as it moved. If you're finding this timeline as tense as I am laying it out, go ahead and hit that like button now. It genuinely helps a case like this reach more people. Back to Minnesota. The signal traced the truck moving north, into Todd County, roughly 80 miles from Watkins, by around 6:30 that morning. The final signal came in around 9 a.m., still in that same area. Then the phone went dark. For investigators, that dead signal was its own kind of data point. A phone that stops transmitting isn't necessarily destroyed or turned off by accident. In an active abduction case, it's often a deliberate act, someone realizing partway through that the device in their possession could be tracked and taking steps to stop that from continuing. Whether that's exactly what happened here was something investigators would only be able to piece together later. But at the time, it meant the one digital thread they had to follow had just gone quiet, and the search had to pivot back toward old-fashioned groundwork, knocking on doors, running down the truck's owner registration, waiting for a tip. At 1:30 that afternoon, with a 5-year-old girl missing and a suspect unaccounted for, the state of Minnesota issued an Amber Alert. In a town where everybody knows everybody, the news moved through Watkins almost instantly. People struggled to process it. A child was gone, and the man believed to have taken her was someone this town had watched play softball on a Friday night, just hours earlier. Meeker County Sheriff Brian Cruze later described the moment plainly to reporters. Law enforcement had done everything they could that day to try to find her safely, and it hadn't been enough. A statement that carried no comfort, only honesty, for a family living through the worst day of their lives. Behind that public statement was a rapidly scaling multi-agency effort. Local deputies were joined within hours by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, whose resources allowed the search radius to widen, well beyond what a single county sheriff's office could cover alone. Investigators split into parallel tracks, one working the physical search of the Watkins area and surrounding roads, another working the digital trail through the cell signal, and a third reaching out to the phone carrier directly for real-time location data rather than waiting on any standard request timeline. In a case where every hour mattered, that kind of coordination between local and state agencies is what turned a missing persons report into an actionable, moving investigation within hours rather than days. Then came the break investigators needed, and it came from a source almost no one would have expected: Zachary Anderson's own father. He called the Cass County Sheriff's Office and told investigators that earlier that morning, his son had called asking permission to drive out to the family's cabin near Motley, in rural Cass County, roughly 90 miles north of Watkins. And then he said the thing that mattered most. He told them he believed his son might be connected to the Amber Alert that had just gone out across the state. He gave police full permission to search the property immediately. Within minutes, deputies were heading north. When they arrived near the Wilderness Park Homeowners Association property in rural Cass County, they got their first major break almost right away. Matt Ertl's stolen pickup truck was found tucked down in a ravine on the Anderson family's land, positioned in a way that made clear it hadn't rolled there by accident. Someone had deliberately hidden it. Deputies moved to the cabin and began clearing it room by room. What they found inside stopped them cold: firearms, ammunition, and a handwritten note believed to have been written by Anderson, one that pointed toward deeply troubling intentions. There was evidence of distress throughout the cabin, but neither Anderson nor Elena was inside. The search pushed outward immediately, into the surrounding woods and swampland. The The decision by Anderson's father to come forward on his own is worth pausing on, because it's easy to move past quickly in a story this dense with detail. This was a parent, presumably still absorbing the news that his son might be connected to a statewide Amber Alert for a missing child, choosing in that moment to call police rather than wait, hesitate, or try to reach his son first. That choice very likely shaved critical hours off a search that was already racing against a ticking clock. A father's decision to prioritize a missing child's safety over any instinct to protect his own son from what was coming. It's one of the only moments of unambiguous good in an otherwise devastating timeline, and investigators later credited it directly with narrowing the search area fast enough to matter. Once deputies were on the property, the pace of discovery accelerated quickly. The positioning of the truck in the ravine told them someone had made a deliberate choice under pressure. Hiding a vehicle isn't instinctive. It's a decision made by someone actively trying to buy time or avoid detection. Combined with what they found inside the cabin, investigators understood almost immediately that they weren't dealing with a confused or panicked person reacting to an accident. They were dealing with someone who had, at minimum, taken concrete steps to conceal what had happened. Deputy William Connor and his K-9 partner, Yankee, began tracking near where the truck had been hidden. Yankee picked up a scent almost right away and started pulling Deputy Connor forward, through thick brush and into the marsh. At around 4:24 that afternoon, about a quarter-mile from the cabin, they found him, Zachary Todd Anderson, standing knee-deep in the water, silent. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He just stood there. A deputy looked at him directly and asked the only question that mattered. "Where is the little girl?" Anderson looked back and said, "What little girl?" Investigators read him his rights on the spot. According to court records, Anderson told investigators he didn't want to talk. He said so 3 times. But with a 5-year-old girl potentially still out there, deputies continued speaking with him, telling him plainly that they needed to bring her home, that he could help make that happen right now. Eventually, they asked him directly, was she here in the swamp or somewhere else? After a long pause, he answered, barely above a whisper, in the swamp. Investigators asked him to confirm it, then asked if he could show them exactly where. He asked for a cigarette and then he started walking. He led them through the water and the marsh and stopped at a specific location. That's where investigators found Elena, hidden in the water beneath debris. A short distance away, roughly 75 feet, a K-9 unit following a second scent trail led officers to another spot. That's where they found her Elsa blanket, the same one her mother had wrapped around her shoulders hours earlier. There's a particular, quiet cruelty in that detail that stayed with investigators long after the case closed. The blanket wasn't found with her. It was found separately, 75 feet away, as though it had been discarded along the way, rather than kept with her, the way a parent would keep something a child needed close. For a family who would spend the rest of their lives replaying the image of that blanket being pulled up to their daughter's chin at 2 a.m., finding it recovered from a swamp, apart from her, is the kind of detail that doesn't need embellishment to land with its full weight. At 6:02 that evening, Sheriff Cruze made it official. The Amber Alert was canceled. Elena Erdl was not coming home. I want to pause on something here, because it becomes important later in this case. The statements Anderson made after he'd already invoked his right to remain silent, including leading deputies to Elena, would later become the subject of a serious legal fight over whether they could even be used in court. We'll get to that. If a detail like that is the kind of thing that keeps you following a case, drop a comment. I read every one, and it shapes what comes next on this channel. The medical examiner's preliminary findings, released in the days that followed, confirmed what investigators had feared from the moment they found Elena in that swamp. Officials described her cause of death plainly as homicidal violence, an intentional death by violent means. The full findings, released later, indicated strangulation and blunt force trauma, along with evidence of sexual assault. The weight of that finding, what had been done to a 5-year-old girl who knew this man, who had no reason to be afraid of him, landed on the entire state of Minnesota with a force that's hard to fully describe. Zachary Todd Anderson, 25 years old, was formally charged and later indicted by a Cass County grand jury on 19 felony counts. The charges included multiple counts of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, first-degree criminal sexual conduct, kidnapping, interference with a dead body, and motor vehicle theft. Bail was set at $2 million without conditions, or $1 million with them. But the charges, as it turned out, were only the beginning. Because once investigators started digging into Anderson's background, what surfaced raised a question the people of Watkins couldn't let go of. Had there been warning signs? Had the system encountered something years earlier and simply never acted on it in a way that could have changed any of this? The answer turned out to be more unsettling than most people were prepared for. In the immediate aftermath of the indictment, local news coverage began piecing together the broader question that would define the rest of this case's public life. Not just what Anderson had done, but who he had been for the 10 years leading up to it. Reporters started reaching out to people who'd known him at different points in his life, and what began as a search for context around a shocking crime turned into something closer to a decade-long timeline of missed signals. A timeline nobody in Watkins had any way of seeing until it was already too late. To find those warning signs, you have to go back a full decade, to 2006, to a quiet residential street in Monticello, Minnesota, in Wright County, where a 15-year-old Zachary Anderson lived in a townhouse with his mother, next door to a single mother raising 2 young children on her own. From the outside, everything looked completely ordinary. But the woman later told investigators, and later spoke publicly about it herself, that Anderson's behavior had started making her deeply uncomfortable early on. He left notes on her car windshield, persistent notes telling her he thought she was beautiful, leaving his phone number, asking her to call him. She was a grown woman in her early 30s. He was a young teenager. At first, she brushed it off as harmless, even joked about having a secret admirer. It didn't stay harmless. Anderson grew more aggressive. Small things at first, like taking her cigarettes, then escalating further. In December of 2006, she was jolted awake at 1:30 in the morning by loud, aggressive banging on her front door. Anderson was outside, demanding she let him in, at one point showing up dressed only in his boxer shorts and insisting she wanted to be with him. He grabbed the door handle and tried to force his way inside. He only backed off when her boyfriend came to the door. That wasn't the end of it. In June of 2007, while she was upstairs with her children asleep, Anderson quietly removed a screen from a first-floor window and let himself into her home in complete silence. He moved through the living room, took her phone off the coffee table, and left without a sound. He was charged with burglary and ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced charge. Because he was a juvenile at the time, the case never became part of the public record, a routine and legally sound protection for young offenders in most circumstances, but one that meant, in this specific case, an entire decade's worth of distance between that pattern of behavior and the next family that trusted him. His sentence was community service and a written letter of apology. The woman later said the letter amounted to about 2 sentences, saying only that he was sorry for scaring her. She was so frightened of him at the time that she eventually left her home entirely, just to feel safe again. When she heard the news in August of 2016, that this same man had been arrested in connection with the death of a 5-year-old girl, she said it felt like the ground had dropped out from under her. She chose to speak publicly afterward. Not for attention, she said, but because she wanted her experience to serve as a warning. That troubling behavior left unaddressed doesn't simply disappear on its own. I want to sit with this part for a second rather than rush past it, because it's the piece of this case that's genuinely hardest to reconcile. Juvenile record sealing exists for good reasons. It gives young people a real chance to move past mistakes without being permanently defined by them. But it also means that a documented decade-long pattern of escalating targeted behavior toward a specific woman was completely invisible to the family that welcomed this same person into their home, around their child, a decade later. There's no clean answer to what should have been done differently. If this tension is landing with you the way it's landing with me, let me know in the comments. The people of Watkins were left holding a question with no comfortable answer. If the system had handled things differently back in 2006, would Elena Ertl still be alive 10 years later? Nobody can say for certain, but the question itself became part of how this case reshaped the conversation around juvenile records, warning signs, and how communities protect the people they trust. The woman at the center of that 2006 and 2007 pattern spoke to local news after Anderson's arrest became public, describing what it felt like to watch a name from a decade earlier suddenly appear attached to the worst kind of headline. She said she'd carried a quiet unease about him for years afterward, even after she moved, even after the case against him closed with nothing more than community service and an apology letter. Hearing his name again in 2016 confirmed something she said she'd always privately suspected, that whatever had driven his behavior toward her hadn't simply gone away because a juvenile court case had ended. It had gone quiet, publicly, while apparently continuing to develop somewhere out of view for another decade. That's the part of this case that resists easy resolution. Juvenile confidentiality protections exist because the alternative, permanently marking teenagers for isolated incidents of poor judgment, causes its own kind of lasting harm, and most young people who go through the juvenile system never reoffend as adults. But this case sits in the narrow, genuinely difficult space where that protection, applied exactly as intended, meant a documented and escalating pattern of targeted behavior toward a specific, named victim simply vanished from the record a decade before it mattered most. Zachary Anderson pleaded not guilty to all 19 charges, and his defense team moved quickly. Their first major effort was a motion to suppress, arguing that Anderson's constitutional rights had been violated during the investigation, since he had invoked his right to remain silent multiple times out in that swamp before questioning continued. Cass County District Court Judge Jana Ostad agreed. She ruled that certain statements obtained from Anderson after he invoked his rights couldn't be used against him at trial. Remarkably, even the act of him leading officers to the location where Elena was found was ruled inadmissible. The defense pushed further, filing a motion to dismiss the entire 19-count indictment, arguing there wasn't sufficient probable cause to proceed given how the statements had been obtained. The judge denied that motion. All 19 charges stayed in place. Prosecutors then made the argument that would prove decisive, that Elena would have been found regardless of what Anderson said or didn't say. The search operation was already fully mobilized. Resources were already converging on that specific area of Cass County, and, critically, all of the physical evidence in the case, the truck, the cabin, the forensic findings from the autopsy, remained fully admissible regardless of the suppression ruling. The case, built on that physical evidence alone, was airtight, and Anderson's legal team knew it. On March 2, 2018, in a Cass County courtroom, Zachary Todd Anderson entered a guilty plea to the most serious charge on the indictment, first-degree murder while committing criminal sexual conduct. In open court, as part of the plea, he was asked directly about the crime, and he admitted to kidnapping Elena, sexually assaulting her, and leaving her for dead in Cass County. The remaining 18 charges were dismissed as part of the agreement. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Minnesota abolished capital punishment in 1911, making life without parole the maximum sentence the state can impose, and that is exactly what Anderson received. Cass County Attorney Benjamin Lindstrom addressed reporters afterward. Their goal, he said, had been to secure the maximum punishment allowed under Minnesota law, life in prison without release, and that's exactly what they'd achieved. He also noted candidly that he was somewhat surprised Anderson had taken the plea at all, since there had been little practical incentive to do so. Had the case gone to a jury trial, he said, the outcome would very likely have been the same, given the strength of the physical evidence. There was no triumph in his words, just the quiet, heavy finality of a case that never should have existed in the first place. The plea hearing itself carried its own particular weight. Victim impact statements from Elena's family were read into the record that same day. A chance, finally, for the people who loved her most to speak directly about what her loss had cost them, in a proceeding that would end with Anderson's fate sealed rather than left open for a 3-week jury trial that had already been scheduled for that April. For a family that had spent a year and a half moving through hearings, suppression motions, and procedural delays, the plea meant an ending arrived faster than anyone expected, though faster, in a case like this, never means easier. If this case has stayed with you the way it's stayed with the people of Watkins for almost a decade now, let me know in the comments which part hit hardest. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We bring you a real story like this one every week. Justice in a courtroom, however necessary, doesn't rebuild what gets destroyed. It doesn't fill an empty bedroom. It doesn't bring back a laugh or a little girl climbing up on a barn roof just to help her dad with something. The community of Watkins understood that better than anyone. In the days after the tragedy, the town did what small towns tend to do when faced with the unthinkable. People came together. A candlelight vigil drew hundreds of attendees at St. Anthony Church in Watkins, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder in the late summer heat. Community members placed angel figurines and flowers in front of the Ertl family's home. A fundraiser was launched to help the family with memorial costs. The initial goal was set at $10,000. It was reached in 8 hours. Within 2 days, it had climbed past $40,000. In the months that followed, a memorial continued to grow outside the family's home. Gifts and cards arriving from people touched by Elena's story, even though they'd never met her. Some from families as far away as other states, writing in simply to say the case had made them want to be more patient with their own children, more present, less likely to take ordinary time for granted. Matt and Kayla Ertl were candid, in the interviews they gave, about how permanently this changed them. The particular, specific difficulty of learning to trust people again after someone you'd welcomed into your home, someone your family considered a friend, turned out to be capable of this. That difficulty didn't go away, but alongside it, they said, they were continually reminded of the good that remained, the support, the community, the small kindnesses that kept arriving long after the news cameras moved on. Perhaps the most powerful response of all came from one person, Elena's mother, Kayla. 2 months after losing her daughter, on October 31st, 2016, the day Elena was supposed to turn 6, the day that was meant for costumes and cake and the specific, uncomplicated joy of a kid turning 6 on Halloween, Kayla made a decision most people in her position might not have had the strength to make. She threw her daughter a birthday party anyway, not as denial, not as avoidance, as an act of love so deliberate and so fierce that it became the foundation of something much larger. That birthday party grew into a charitable effort called Sharing Elena's Love, built entirely around who Elena had been. Toys donated to children in local hospitals, care packages assembled for families going through hard times, quiet acts of generosity, carried out without fanfare, without any need for recognition, distributed the same way Elena had always given her affection, freely and without conditions. One of the earliest recipients was a local family whose young daughter was undergoing treatment for a rare form of bone cancer. Proceeds from a Sharing Elena's Love fundraiser went directly to help cover the costs of her care, and the family later said it was events exactly like that one that kept Elena's memory alive in the most meaningful way they could imagine. What makes Kayla's response so remarkable isn't just the act itself, but the sustained nature of it. Grief like this doesn't resolve into a single gesture and then fade. It tends to demand something ongoing, some outlet that doesn't ask a parent to simply move past what happened. Sharing Elena's Love gave the family exactly that, a way to keep showing up for other people, year after year, in Elena's name, rather than being left with nothing to do but carry the loss privately. Neighbors who watched the effort grow over the following years described it as one of the few things that seemed to genuinely bring the family a measure of peace amid an otherwise unrelenting grief. Kayla had once told her daughter that a sunset was like someone looking down at her from heaven. Simple words, spoken long before either of them could have known the weight those words would eventually carry. After August 20th, 2016, Kayla began to see her daughter there, in the colors stretching across the Minnesota sky at the close of every day, in that quiet pause between light and dark that the whole world seems to hold its breath for, just for a few seconds. In 2023, the community of Watkins made sure that pause would be permanent. A statue memorial was unveiled in McCarthy Park, a lasting tribute to a little girl who, in just 5 short years of life, left a mark deep enough that an entire town still carries it nearly a decade later. Zachary Todd Anderson remains behind bars at a Minnesota correctional facility. No appeal has overturned his plea. No legal effort has loosened the grip of that sentence. He will spend the rest of his life inside those walls. This case left a mark on Minnesota that went beyond the borders of one small town. It shaped conversations among child safety advocates and legal scholars about how juvenile confidentiality laws intersect with public safety later in life, not necessarily arguing those laws should change, since the reasoning behind them remains sound in the overwhelming majority of cases, but acknowledging that this specific case sits in the narrow, uncomfortable space where the protection worked exactly as designed and still left a devastating gap. It also reinforced something law enforcement in small communities already understood instinctively, but rarely got to see stated so plainly, that a coordinated, urgent, multi-agency response in the first hours of a child's disappearance can make the difference between a case that ends in tragedy after a day and one that never gets resolved at all. Elena wasn't found alive, but she was found, quickly, and specifically because so many people, from local deputies to state investigators, to a father willing to make an impossible phone call, treated every single hour as though it mattered, because it did. And in Watkins, Minnesota, at the end of most days when the sky turns pink and purple, the colors Elena loved most, there's a mother who still looks up and finds her daughter there. There are no perfect endings in stories like this one. There are only the pieces people choose to pick up, the names they refuse to let fade, and the quiet decision, made new every single day, to keep going. Elena Jeannie Ertl, born October 31st, 2010, loved every single day, forever. If this story moved you, share it. And if you're new here, subscribe. We tell real stories about real people, because every one of them deserves to be remembered accurately.